As of 2024, all but 6 of the world's nations officially call themselves democracies. This remarkable fact is evidence of the enduring appeal of popular sovereignty and the long-term success of generations of activists and organizers who have slowly but surely moved humanity out of a world where repressive monarchy was the norm. Even if the intricacies of political systems and political philosophies around the world differ significantly, people from many cultures and countries seem to agree at some level that legitimacy for authority and leadership comes from the people. Of course, the truth is that many of the nations claiming to be democracies do not actually function that way in reality. But it is an interesting argument for the advancement of democratic rights that only Vatican City, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Qatar, and Brunei officially assert that their sovereignty originates from a source other than the consent of the governed. This means that even in regimes which are not truly democratic, at least some perfunctory effort must be made to conceal that reality from the people they govern and the global community at large. Whether the charade is a convincing one is another matter. For these countries, democracy may be an empty ritual, but it is one given near sacramental status by the shared modern reverence for government of the people and by the people, and the recognition that international observers and internal dissidents must be placated to some degree, even if everyone involved knows that everyone knows it's all a sham. So if the UN were able to send a team of democratic observers to the elections of ancient Rome, what would they find? Would the elections meet our modern standards of transparency and openness? But perhaps more importantly, would the average Roman even care about our assessment of their system? Before we begin, we must emphasize that even at its republican height, Rome never claimed to be a democracy. While to our modern sensibilities the terms republic and democracy have become virtually interchangeable, in the ancient world, it was widely recognized that there was an enormous gulf between the two systems. In fact, the Roman system was specifically constructed to accept some input from citizens, but also to intentionally limit their power. In doing so, the Romans believed that they were avoiding the pitfalls of radical democracies like Athens. By definition, then, Rome was not a democracy. That's no judgment or criticism, but rather a distinction that would have been echoed and even touted by the Romans themselves. But what did it mean to live in this republic? How were elections conducted? Was the average Roman content with his ability to influence politics? We'll have to speak in broad terms here, because throughout the life of the Republic, the Roman assemblies were not static. They were complex and dynamic systems that changed over time depending upon material conditions, the shape of the electorate, and the balance of power between the classes that made up the Roman state. Roman citizens elected magistrates and approved or rejected laws presented to them by the magistrates. However, they did so in a manner that is unfamiliar to us and which appears strange even when compared to other ancient societies. For example, the more direct democracy of ancient Athens allowed citizens to vote directly on laws and policies, with a simple majority of votes carrying the day. The citizens themselves were the entire legislative arm of government. While this was also true to some degree in Rome, there were significant barriers in place to ensure that issues were not carried merely by a majority of voters, but rather by a majority of those viewed as the true stakeholders of the Roman state. This extraordinary level of direct citizen involvement was only tolerable in Athens because the Athenians jealously guarded their citizenship rights, ensuring that citizenship remained a privilege of the few, whereas in Rome, there was always a conceivable path to citizenship even for slaves. Athenian citizenship wasn't just exclusive to men and the freeborn. Those qualifications were assumed, but to those who could trace their lineage back to pure Athenian roots. Though Athenian democracy is often hailed as a breakthrough in popular sovereignty, we must acknowledge the exclusionary nature of Athenian citizenship and the system's inherent limitations and biases. It was, for example, no more inclined than its neighbors to grant rights to women or slaves, and its never-ending quest to dominate the other cities of Greece certainly do not reflect any commitment to justice or equality beyond its borders. However, Athens was viewed as unacceptably radical by those who formulated the constitution of the Roman Republic, and from the beginning, Rome's system was created to prohibit Athens' high level of direct citizen involvement. The Romans' far more complex system had the effect of alienating its people from the political process. Whereas Athens had only a single assembly, the Romans had 3, and then eventually 4, separate assemblies, each with different roles and responsibilities. The composition of each assembly was determined according to different criteria, and none of them adhered to the one man, one vote principle that we hold sacrosanct today. Instead, results were determined through an obscure system of group voting. Citizens were separated into groups known as centuries, and the members of each group voted to generate a single group vote. In practice, this meant that a candidate who swept a group of 2,000 voters would be tied in the official tally with an opponent who narrowly won a group of just 150. Both would have received a total of one vote. This had a distorting effect on Roman elections, for not only were the centuries far from uniform in size, but a candidate could easily lose an election despite receiving more absolute votes than his opponents, provided he carried the centuries he won by large margins and only lost narrowly in others. Think of how the American Electoral College can result in less popular candidates winning elections. Magnify that by 10, and you'll begin to understand the remarkably undemocratic nature of Republican elections. Though different qualifications were used to split voters, this arcane system of grouping was consistently used in all of Rome's assemblies to water down popular sentiment and allow the elite to maintain a stranglehold on power and influence in the Republic. The earliest form of assembly was the Comitia Curiata, which had its roots in the ancient monarchy before the dawn of the Republic. This archaic system was based on the division of the people into 30 curiae, or clans, that represented the original patrician families. The Comitia Curiata had the authority to elect certain magistrates and hear judicial cases, but under the monarchy its powers had been limited, as magistrates were subservient to the king. While plebeians could attend, voting was only open to patricians, which reinforced the social and political dominance of the original patrician families. However, after the overthrow of the Tarquin dynasty, this assembly was gradually marginalized by the rise of the Comitia Centuriata, or Centuriate Assembly, which had the power to elect praetors, consuls, and censors, as well as to pass laws and declare war. In theory, this placed enormous power in the hands of the new assembly, and, by extension, the Roman people themselves. Still, for much of the Republic, the Centuriate Assembly was also dominated by the patricians, through the division of voting power, as well as formal networks of clientship and patronage that ensured their continued influence and control over those in lower orders. Those living in modern democracies can justly complain about the outsized influence of the wealthy, but in strictly legal terms, their votes count just the same as ours. The Centuriate Assembly, in contrast, was explicitly organized to give more influence to the wealthy. The voting citizens were divided into 193 centuries, or units, that reflected the wealth and the corresponding military role of the citizens of each group. The votes of all members of the century would be tallied, and the century's one vote would be awarded to the candidate who received the largest share. The principle behind the unwieldy and complex century system was ostensibly that those who furnished the most expensive military equipment and those who deployed to the most dangerous parts of the Roman army's battles deserved a greater share in how the public policy was formed. This was how the distribution of influence was rationalized. But because centuries were not of equal size, it had the practical effect of placing political power almost exclusively within the highest echelons of Roman society, which was no accident. The absurdity of the system comes into view when we explore just how many more citizens were assigned to the lower class voting centuries. The centuries of the upper propertied classes would have only contained a few hundred voters, while at the very bottom, many thousands of landless urban poor would have been enrolled in the capitae censi, those counted by their heads rather than their property. Adding insult to injury, the wealthiest centuries voted first, meaning that an issue could effectively be settled long before the poor even had a chance to cast their ballots. This discouraged poorer voters from even showing up to the assembly, especially when it would involve a trip from the countryside that they could scarcely afford. The radical tribune Gaius Gracchus put forward a proposal to have the centuries vote in a random order, so that all citizens would have a chance to cast ballots on equal terms, but it was never passed. All told, the centuries of the first class accounted for a significantly smaller portion of the total population compared to the masses in the capitae censi, but made up 80 out of a total 193 centuries in the assembly, compared to just 1 for the urban poor. Wealthy equestrians, who constituted the officer class of the Roman military, counted for 18 further centuries, meaning that all told, the upper echelons represented 98 of the 193 total voting units. If all voted together, this granted them a majority. While the influence of the elite was disproportionate, they were rarely united, meaning that those in poorer centuries did have some chance to make their voices heard. Average Roman citizens guarded their political rights fiercely, indicating that they at least felt that they exerted some influence, or maybe just sought to retain their vote so that they could sell it to the highest bidder. This seemed to be a system most Romans could live with, at least until the unprecedented fracturing of elite consensus during the late Republic. As inter-elite rivalries heightened the contradictions inherent in the Republic, it entered a death spiral of contested elections and disputes over legitimacy. After the Centuriate Assembly, Republican Rome's next primary political body was the Tribal Assembly, with tribes, determined by geographical origin, serving as the voting unit. Though not explicitly organized according to wealth, this assembly was also stacked in favor of the rich. Citizens were divided into 35 tribes according to residence, with those residing in Rome accounting for only 4, and those with property outside the city making up the remaining 31. Though there would have certainly been poor citizens in these areas as well, we must remember that all elections took place in Rome, and that only those with means could travel to the city for something as frivolous as an election. We do, however, sometimes hear of mass migrations of rural citizens during important votes, as happened when Tiberius Gracchus carried his monumental land bill in 133. But to counter this, the wealthy could always roll out religious objections and other delaying tactics, which stalled the vote until rural citizens could no longer remain in the city. Then it simply became a war of attrition over which side would break first. The fourth assembly, and the last to be established, was the Plebeian Assembly, which only came into being as a result of widespread discontentment among less established Roman citizens who felt that they had been systematically alienated from the Republic's mechanisms of decision-making. Plebeian organization and agitation culminated in what came to be known as the secession of the plebs, a series of mass general strikes that saw plebeians leave the city as part of a sustained campaign for greater rights and representation. The direct action was risky. Had the solidarity of the plebs not been ironclad, there could have been severe penalties for the organizers and instigators. Ultimately, however, their threats to the established order carried the day, and plebeians were granted new rights that began to level the playing field. Having successfully demonstrated their collective power, plebeians effectively set up a parallel state apparatus, including the new Plebeian Assembly. It would serve as the voice of the people and select magistrates such as the plebeian aediles and the tribunate, a position in which only plebeians were eligible to serve. Though only plebeians were allowed to participate in the new assembly, the results it generated were eventually recognized as law for the entire republic. It was a venue known for radical agitation, but it was also responsible for significant legislation. The assembly mandated the publication of the full legal code, ordered the admission of plebeians to priesthoods and all magistracies, passed laws that regulated debt and land, and allowed for marriage between the orders. Though the Plebeian Assembly was an attempted counterbalance, the complexity of the Romans' election systems combined unfavorably with a deeply ingrained conservative political culture which consistently sought to dilute the popular voice. Even with the addition of the Plebeian Assembly, it is not certain whether Roman elections would measure up to modern standards of free and fair. That's not even to mention the open corruption, intimidation of voters, or the fact that the secret ballot was not even instituted until 193 BCE. These factors also weigh heavily against the idea that Roman elections were in any way comparable to legitimate expressions of popular will. But it's easy to make these critiques 2,000 years after the fall of the Republic, and in doing so, to hold the Romans to standards to which they never tried or claimed to adhere. After all, even during the tumult of the most strident plebeian agitation, there are no records indicating that plebeians themselves sought to institute a one-man, one-vote system akin to Athens. It's not that they had a blinkered imagination, nor were they unaware of these possibilities. They knew about the principle of equal representation, not just from Athens, but from the dealings of their own personal lives, where they participated in family councils or made business decisions based on consensus. It's tempting for us moderns to assume that the plebeians were simply ignorant of the equal representation principle, because that means we don't have to grapple with their decision to consciously reject the foundations of our system of government. But doing so is taking the easy way out, and not treating the Romans or their ideas honestly. In reading history, there's a tendency to make common cause with the ancient past and enlist noteworthy figures as modern standard bearers. But the people of Rome, even those that serve as our most direct analogs, were radically distinct from us. Their worldviews are almost totally alien to our own. Our 21st century ideas of freedom, equality, and justice, as well as the class consciousness required to actually fight for these things, were utterly lacking in ancient Rome. We should count ourselves enormously lucky to live now instead of then. Confronting this requires us to acknowledge that our experiences and even our views may not be as universal as we wish. This can be a frightening prospect, but it can also be liberating. The differences of the ancients can remind us to appreciate the prevailing democratic values of our unique historical moment. They can help us remember that history is by no means a march toward progress. They can teach us that popular sovereignty may grow, or it may decay in the decades to come, for in politics, little is permanent. And they can comfort us, for we are at least fortunate enough to have a hand in shaping our own destiny. The past is worth learning from, and the future is worth fighting for.
Hi, Gaius here. Thanks for being part of our efforts to shed light on the more obscure topics related to the fascinating world of the ancient Romans. If you enjoyed Titus's work here, please do us a favor by liking and subscribing. Gratias vobis ago.